They called me incorruptible. For 217 years, I had walked the vigil beneath Terra, had maintained the seals on doors that should never open, had stood watch over prisoners whose very existence violated the laws of reality itself. My brothers said my faith made me perfect for this duty. I believed them. I believed in my own immutability, in the absolute nature of my purpose, in the certainty that what I guarded could never touch what I was. My name is Valorian Teth, Shadow Keeper of the Adeptus Custodes, third Warden of the Deep Vaults. And I want you to understand this before anything else. I was not corrupted. I was educated. The question is not whether the dark cells can change the Emperor's guardians. The question is whether that change was always the purpose. The first thing you must know about the dark cells is that they exist beneath the Imperial Palace, at a depth that renders conventional measurement meaningless. We descend through the vaults of rememoration, past the crypts where the 10,000 rest between deployments, down through geological strata that predate human settlement of Terra, into spaces that were not excavated but discovered. The Mechanicum maintains that these chambers are artificial, carved during the Unification Wars by technologies now lost. I have walked their corridors for centuries. The walls breathe. They expand and contract in rhythms that do not match my heartbeat, or the palace's ventilation cycles, or any mechanical system known to function. I reported this 17 times during my first decade of service. Each report was acknowledged, filed, archived. No one ever responded with concern. That should have told me something. But faith is a powerful anesthetic against curiosity. My duty cycle began each morning at the tolling of matins, when the bells of the Sanctum Imperialis rang across the palace complex. I would descend through the Eternity Gate's substructure, past check stations manned by Sisters of Silence, whose presence ensured no psychic contamination could reach the surface, down spiral staircases that corkscrewed through bedrock for distances that made my augmented physiology register fatigue. The temperature dropped 2 degrees Celsius for every 100 meters of descent. By the time I reached my posting at Vault Tertius, the air hung at -18 degrees, cold enough that my breath formed clouds of vapor that the dim lumens caught and held suspended like frozen prayers. I preferred the cold. It was empirical, measurable, real. It reminded me that despite where I stood, physical laws still applied. My routine was methodical, precise, comforting in its repetition. I would inspect each sealed door in my assigned section, running gauntleted fingers along the edges of containment fields that hummed with barely contained power, checking for fluctuations in the energy readings displayed on monitors older than most Imperial worlds. The cells were numbered sequentially, though gaps existed in the sequence that no archive explained. Cell 47, Cell 49, Cell 50, no Cell 48, Cell 106 through Cell 113, no Cell 114. I had memorized every absence, every discontinuity, filed them away as mysteries I would investigate once my 2 centuries of service concluded and I rotated to surface duty. That rotation was standard procedure. Every Shadow Keeper served their time in the deeps and then returned to the light, their faith tested and proven, their loyalty beyond question. I had 91 years remaining in my vigil. I believed I would complete them unchanged. The cells themselves defied easy description, not because they were complex, but because they were wrong. Each door was fashioned from adamantium laced with psycho-reactive alloys, engraved with wards that made my eyes ache if I looked at them too long, sealed with mechanisms that bore the personal seal of the Emperor himself. Some doors were small, barely large enough for a human to pass through if they crouched. Others towered 30 meters high, scaled for creatures or entities or errors of such magnitude that containing them required architecture that hurt to contemplate. Behind those doors lay the Imperium's most profound secrets, the things too dangerous to destroy and too terrible to acknowledge. We called them prisoners, but that was a linguistic convenience. Many of them predated the concept of imprisonment. Some of them existed in states that made the word alive a categorical failure. I would pause at each door during my inspection, placing my palm against the cold metal, feeling for the subtle vibrations that indicated containment integrity. The cells sang. That is the only word that captures it. Each one produced a frequency that my enhanced hearing could detect, a harmonic that seemed to resonate not through the air, but through my bones, through the ceramite of my armor, through the augmented musculature that made me more than human. Cell 23 sang in a pitch that made my teeth ache. Cell 67 produced a sound like distant weeping that never quite resolved into actual sobs. Cell 91 was silent, but the silence had texture, weight, presence. I logged each anomaly in my patrol reports, noting variations from baseline measurements, documenting the cell's behavior with the precision my training demanded. My reports were always acknowledged, never questioned, never acted upon. The other Shadow Keepers walked their own patrols in adjacent sections, passing through common areas during rotation changes, exchanging brief nods of recognition, but rarely speaking. This was tradition, we were taught. Silence was a form of discipline, a way of maintaining focus in an environment that attacked concentration simply by existing. My brothers were stationed at regular intervals throughout the deep vaults, each responsible for monitoring their assigned cells, each performing the same rituals of inspection and documentation that gave structure to our vigil. I knew their names, their histories, their deeds of valor that had earned them selection for this posting. Castellan Vrax had held the Eternity Gate alone against a demonic incursion for 17 hours, while the Sisters of Silence evacuated a breach point. Sentinel Callus had killed a Genestealer Patriarch with his bare hands after his guardian spear shattered. These were heroes, legends among our order. They walked the deeps with me, and they spoke even less than protocol required. I noticed patterns in their silence. Vrax, who had commanded tactical squads with eloquent brutality, now communicated only through hand signals and curt nods. Callus, who had sung war hymns during the Patriarch's execution, kept his vox grills sealed at all times, even during the brief moments when we gathered in the rest chamber to consume our nutrient rations. Brother Sentinel Theron, who had served in the deeps for 300 years and was nearing his rotation date, looked at me once with eyes that held something I could not name. Not fear, not warning. Something closer to pity, or recognition, or resignation. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, then turned away. He completed his rotation 6 months later and ascended to the surface. I received word 3 days after that he had requested immediate deployment to the most hazardous war zone available. He died fighting orcs on Ulanor, charging into enemy lines alone, seeking death with the kind of fervor men usually reserve for life. I did not understand why. Not then. The cells were not merely containers. They were designed to do something beyond simple imprisonment, though this truth took me decades to recognize. The wards carved into each door were not just locks, but filters, membranes that allowed certain things to pass through while containing others. Information leaked, not words or images or anything so crude as data, but concepts, implications, questions that embedded themselves in my thoughts with the patience of stone eroding underwater. I would inspect cell 47 and find myself wondering what crime could be so severe that the Emperor himself decreed it must be preserved rather than destroyed. I would stand before the massive portal of cell 107 and feel the weight of the question pressing against my consciousness like a physical force. What happens when reality makes a mistake it cannot unmake? Time behaved incorrectly in the deep vaults. My armor's chronometer would register that I had been on patrol for 6 hours, but my physiological indicators suggested 8 or 4. The discrepancy varied, never consistent enough to suggest malfunction, but too frequent to dismiss as error. I attributed this to warp residue, to the proximity of entities whose very existence distorted causality, to the fact that some of the cells contained prisoners who experienced duration differently than baseline reality allowed. This rationalization satisfied me because I needed it too. Faith requires certainty, and certainty requires explanation, and I had been trained to construct explanations from insufficient data because acknowledging ignorance was the first step toward doubt. I did not doubt. I patrolled, I inspected, I documented, I maintained. I was incorruptible. The food in the rest chamber arrived via automated servitor delivery at intervals that corresponded to meal schedules used on the palace surface. The nutrient paste was precisely balanced for custodian metabolism, providing optimal caloric intake and biochemical support for our enhanced physiology. It tasted like nothing, which was by design. Flavor was distraction. The Emperor's guardians did not require pleasure, only function. I consumed my rations methodically, cleaning my mess kit with the same attention to detail I applied to weapons maintenance, returning each implement to its designated position before resuming my duties. This was how I understood my existence, as a series of procedures executed flawlessly, each action justified by its place within a greater pattern, each moment of service accumulating toward a total that would eventually equal a life well spent. I prayed before each patrol shift, reciting the litany of vigilance that every Shadow Keeper learned upon selection for deep vault duty. I stand in darkness, that others may live in light. I guard what must not be freed. I bear witness to what must not be known. I am the seal upon forbidden doors. I am the silence that protects. I am incorruptible. The words felt good in my mouth, solid and true, anchoring me to purpose. I believed every syllable. I believed that my faith was armor against corruption, that my loyalty was absolute, that the 217 years I had served were proof of my immutability. I believed that when I walked past cell 114 that did not exist, and felt the wrongness radiating from the empty space in the sequence. I was experiencing something external to myself rather than something the cells were teaching me to perceive. The wrongness started small, so small I almost missed it. During my routine inspection of Sector 7, I noticed that Cell 86 had developed a crack in its containment field. Not a failure, nothing critical, just a hairline fracture in the psychoreactive matrix that caused the energy readings to fluctuate by 0.03% outside acceptable parameters. I documented this in my patrol report, noting the precise location of the flaw, recommending immediate maintenance attention. The report was acknowledged within the hour. Standard procedure dictated that Mechanicum Tech priests would arrive within one duty cycle to perform repairs. They did not come. I filed a follow-up report the next day. Acknowledged. No response. The crack widened. 0.05% variance. 0.08. Still within technically acceptable tolerances, but trending toward failure. I filed 7 reports over the course of 3 weeks, all acknowledged. No repairs came. The crack stabilized at 0.12% variance, then stopped growing. I performed my inspection of Cell 86 each day, expecting to find the flaw had progressed, preparing myself to escalate my reports to emergency protocols if containment appeared compromised. The variance remained constant. Weeks became months. The crack became a permanent feature of my patrol routine, something I documented in every report with the same precision I brought to all my duties. I told myself this was acceptable. Containment remained functional. The prisoner, whatever it was, remained secure. Procedures had been followed. My faith in the system was not contingent on immediate action, but on trust that those with authority over me possessed information I lacked. If they deemed the crack acceptable, then it was acceptable. This logic satisfied me. It should not have, but it did. Then I heard Cell 86 speak my name. Not the name I used in service, not the designation Third Warden or the formal address Brother Custodian Teth that my fellows employed. It used the name I had borne before my selection, before my transformation, before I became one of the 10,000. The name my mother had given me in the final moments before the Emperor's agents took me from her arms and remade me into something beyond human. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 217 years. I had nearly forgotten it myself, had filed it away in memory sectors reserved for information no longer relevant to function. The cell whispered it through the crack in its containment field, and every atom of my being froze in recognition. "Us Valorian," the cell said. Not shouted, not screamed, just spoke conversationally, as if we were old friends meeting by chance. "You have been vigilant, Valorian. You have maintained your post with admirable precision. Do you know what I am?" I did not respond. Protocol was explicit. Prisoners were never to be engaged in communication. Any attempt at contact was to be ignored and immediately reported to senior command. I completed my inspection of the containment field, documented the stable point 12% variance, moved to the next cell in my patrol sequence. My hands were steady. My heartbeat remained controlled. But something in the architecture of my certainty had developed a crack of its own. Hairline and small, barely noticeable, trending toward instability. The next day, Cell 86 spoke again. You filed 19 reports about the crack in my door, Valorian. 19 requests for maintenance that were acknowledged and ignored. Do you wonder why? I did not respond. I inspected the containment field. Variance holding at 0.12%, functionally stable. I moved to Cell 87. Cell 86 continued speaking behind me, its voice carrying through the crack with perfect clarity despite the meters of adamantium and psycho-reactive alloys that should have rendered it inaudible. The crack was intentional. They made it. So I could speak to you, so you could begin to understand. I filed my report. Acknowledged. No action taken. I maintained my silence for 27 days. Cell 86 spoke during each inspection. Never urgent, never threatening, just conversational observations about my routine, about the other cells, about the nature of the deep vaults themselves. I ignored every word, performing my duties with mechanical precision, refusing to acknowledge that communication was occurring. But I listened. I could not help but listen, because sound travels whether you wish it to or not. And the prisoner's voice was designed to carry meaning directly into the parts of my mind that processed information before faith could filter it out. On the 28th day, Cell 86 said something that bypassed all my defenses. The cell that contained my brother is empty now. Cell 114. They moved him to you. He is walking your patrol route inside your skull, teaching you to see. Can you feel him yet? There was no Cell 114. The sequence jumped from Cell 113 to Cell 115, a gap in numbering that archives attributed to administrative error during the dark age of technology. But I had walked past that empty space in the sequence thousands of times, and I had always felt wrongness radiating from the absence, a presence-shaped void that my senses insisted should be occupied despite all evidence to the contrary. If Cell 86 was telling the truth, if Cell 114 existed in some state that rendered it invisible to direct observation but detectable through its effects on surrounding reality, then what else about my understanding of this place was structured around comforting lies? I reported the communication, full disclosure, exact transcription, professional documentation of a containment breach requiring immediate attention. My report was acknowledged within minutes. Senior Command responded with a single line of text. Continue standard patrol. Phenomenon is expected. Maintain vigilance. Expected. The prisoner speaking my childhood name was expected. The crack in the containment field was expected. My confusion, my doubt, my growing sense that the architecture of my faith was riddled with similar cracks that had been deemed acceptable variances. All of it was expected. I stood in the rest chamber reading that response over and over, searching for additional meaning in the sparse words, finding only the implication that whatever was happening to me had happened before, to others, and that command considered it unremarkable enough to require no intervention beyond the instruction to maintain standard procedure. I began to watch my brother Shadow Keepers with new attention, studying their behavior for signs that they too had experienced what I was experiencing. Castellan Vrax walked his patrol with eyes that tracked movement where nothing moved, head cocking at angles that suggested he was listening to sounds the rest of us could not hear. Brother Callus maintained perfect silence, but his hands shook during the brief moments when he thought no one was watching, a tremor that betrayed chemical imbalance or neurological stress in defiance of custodian physiology's legendary stability. Sentinel Theron, in the final weeks before his rotation to surface duty, had moved through the deep vaults like a man walking through water, each step requiring visible effort, as if gravity itself had turned hostile toward him. They knew something. They had learned something, and they had chosen not to speak about it, not to warn me, not to break whatever code of silence kept Shadow Keepers isolated, even from each other. The thought formed slowly, resistant to acknowledgement. We were not guarding the cells from escaping. We were being exposed to them deliberately, systematically, as if containment was the secondary function and the primary purpose was something else entirely. But that could not be correct. The Emperor himself had designated the Adeptus Custodes as wardens of these prisons. The 10,000 were incorruptible by definition, our genetic and psychological augmentation rendering us immune to the very concept of compromise. If the cells could affect us, then the entire premise of our deployment here collapsed into paradox, unless the Emperor had anticipated that effect, unless exposure was the purpose, and incorruptibility was not immunity, but rather the capacity to withstand transformation without breaking entirely. I filed my reports with obsessive attention to detail, documenting every instance of communication from Cell 86, every moment when shadows fell at angles inconsistent with light source positions, every occasion when my chronometer disagreed with my physiological indicators about the passage of time. Every report was acknowledged. None generated action beyond the standard instruction to maintain vigilance. The pattern was so consistent that it ceased to feel like oversight and began to feel like observation, as if my reports were not requests for assistance, but data points in some experiment whose parameters I did not understand, and whose hypothesis regarded me as a test subject rather than a guardian. 3 months after Cell 86 first spoke my name, I discovered the first clear evidence that my duty was not what I had believed it to be. I was performing routine inspection of the documentation archives, cross-referencing current patrol logs against historical records to identify any long-term trends in containment stability. This was not required by my duty roster, but I performed it anyway, needing the comfort of procedure when my certainty about purpose had developed too many cracks to ignore. I found a report filed 240 years ago by a Shadow Keeper named WH40K, 3rd Warden of the Deep Vaults, assigned to the same patrol route I now walked. The report documented communication from Cell 86. Same cell, same prisoner, different custodian. The prisoner had spoken his name too, the name from before his transformation. And WH40K had filed identical reports requesting maintenance for a crack in the containment field that generated identical responses, instructing him to maintain standard vigilance. I searched deeper, found reports from 400 years prior, 600, 900. Every 3rd warden assigned to this patrol route had documented communication from Cell 86. Everyone had noted the same hairline crack in the same location. Everyone had filed reports that generated acknowledgement without action. The crack was permanent. The communication was intentional, and every Shadow Keeper who walked this vigil discovered this truth alone, in isolation, with no warning from those who came before, because the silence we maintained was not discipline, but a symptom of what the cells did to us. We did not speak about what we learned, because by the time we learned it, we had already begun to change into something that understood why silence was the only appropriate response. I could have stopped there, could have accepted that my duty was not what I believed, but continued to perform it anyway, maintaining the comfortable fiction that service justified itself regardless of understanding. But the crack in my certainty had widened beyond 0.12% variance. Questions multiplied like cells dividing, each answer generating 3 new uncertainties. If the communication was intentional, what was its purpose? If previous wardens had all experienced the same pattern, what had they learned that made them choose silence? If the Emperor knew this would happen, why had he not prepared me for it with knowledge rather than faith? Faith was supposed to be sufficient. Faith was supposed to be armor. But armor is only useful if the attack comes from outside. And whatever was happening to me was happening from within, in spaces where I had welcomed it through the very act of performing my duties flawlessly. Cell 86 continued speaking during my inspections, but its tone had shifted from conversational to tutorial. It was teaching me, deliberately and patiently, walking me through implications I could have discovered myself if I had been willing to question the comfortable structure of my faith. Your brother Theron requested deployment to Ulanor because he could not bear to remain in the palace knowing what he knew. Cell 86 said, he chose death in battle over death by understanding. Do you judge him weak for that choice, Valorian? Or was he stronger than you because he recognized that some knowledge destroys the vessel it fills? I wanted to challenge this assertion, to defend Theron's honor against the implication that he had fled rather than failed. But I had seen his eyes in those final weeks, had recognized that look I could not name. It was not fear, it was comprehension. He had learned something that made continued existence unbearable, and rather than live with that knowledge, he had chosen to die as the hero he had always been, preserving the version of himself that fit the story we told about what custodians were. I could have made the same choice, could have requested immediate rotation, sought deployment to any front line, hostile enough to guarantee death with honor. But I stayed. I continued my patrol. I filed my reports. I listened to Cell 86 teach me why Theron's choice had been the wiser one. The dark cells do not contain chaos, Cell 86 said. Chaos is external, the realm of gods and demons, the Imperium that threatens human extinction. These cells contain something worse. They contain mistakes that reality made and could not unmake. Experiments the Emperor performed that should not have succeeded. Futures that almost happened. Weapons that were too dangerous to use, but too valuable to destroy. Technologies that violated the laws of physics and kept functioning anyway. Pieces of the dark age of technology that survived their own impossible nature. You guard the Imperium's original sins, Valorian. The things humanity did before we understood that some doors should never be opened. The Emperor buried them here not because they were evil, but because they were true. And the Imperium requires certain truths remain hidden if the species is to survive long enough to be worth saving. I wanted this to be lies. Wanted Cell 86 to be what doctrine taught. A prisoner attempting psychological manipulation, trying to corrupt my faith, seeking any leverage that might create an opening for escape. But prisoners who sought escape did not explain their own nature with such clinical precision. They raged against containment. They bargained for freedom. They attacked the certainties that kept their wardens loyal. Cell 86 was doing something entirely different. It was educating me, teaching me to understand what I guarded so that I could guard it properly, with knowledge replacing faith as the foundation for duty. The problem was that knowledge corroded the very foundations faith had constructed. I could maintain my vigil based on belief that the Emperor's wisdom was absolute. I could not maintain it based on understanding that the Emperor had made choices whose justification required his guardians to become something other than what we believed ourselves to be. I started reviewing other cell documentation with systematic intensity, cross-referencing patrol logs against incident reports, searching for patterns that would reveal the true nature of what the deep vaults contained. Cell 23, the one whose containment field sang in a pitch that made teeth ache, held something labeled only as Null Architecture Prototype. The description was fragmentary, but suggested a weapon designed during the Age of Strife that could erase buildings not by destroying them, but by making reality forget they had ever existed. Populations would wake in rubble with no memory of what had stood there, no records, no evidence, just absences shaped like homes and factories and temples that had been excised from causality itself. The weapon had worked, had been deployed against Terran hive cities during the Unification Wars, rendering entire districts into voids that maps no longer acknowledged. The Emperor had buried it here, not because it was heretical, but because it was too effective, too tempting, too applicable to problems that should require more difficult solutions than simple erasure. Cell 67, the one that wept without resolution, contained what archives referred to as Biological Optimism Index 7. The clinical language concealed casual obscenity. It was a plague, engineered during humanity's golden age, designed not to kill, but to make people so satisfied with their current state that ambition ceased entirely. Infected populations stopped inventing, stopped competing, stopped striving for improvement because they had achieved perfect contentment with subsistence. The Imperium had discovered a world where this plague still lingered, where billions of humans lived in Stone Age conditions despite possessing intact archaeotech, because none of them could generate sufficient motivation to remember how the machines worked. They were happy, perfectly, terminally happy, evolutionarily dead, but experientially fulfilled. The Emperor had exterminated them, cleansed the world with fire. Then he had captured a sample of the plague and locked it in Cell 67, where it wept for the contentment it could no longer provide. Cell 91, the one whose silence had texture, held nothing. This was not absence like Cell 114's non-existence. Cell 91 was verifiably, measurably empty, its containment field active, but surrounding a void that sensors insisted should not be classifiable as nothing, because nothing was the absence of properties, and the void in Cell 91 possessed the property of being aggressively, hostilely empty, in a way that made quantum mechanics scream in protest. Something had been imprisoned there once, something so fundamentally incompatible with existence that when it was removed, it left a hole that reality could not fill back in. The cell was a scar, a permanent wound in the fabric of what was possible, maintained in the deep vaults as a reminder that some victories leave marks that never heal. These were not heretical artifacts. They were not corruption or chaos or Xenos threats. They were pieces of humanity's true history, the things we had made before we learned wisdom, the mistakes that revealed our capacity for horrors that required no external enemy to justify. The Emperor had gathered them here, buried them beneath Terra, locked them away not because they were evil, but because they were us, our ambition, our ingenuity, our willingness to remake reality according to our desires without calculating whether those desires would destroy us. The Imperium was built on the suppression of this history, on the myth that humanity's fall was external rather than self-inflicted, on the doctrine that faith could protect us from threats we did not create. Every cell I guarded was evidence that this doctrine was a necessary lie. I understood then why Shadow Keepers maintained silence. We learned the truth, and we could not speak it, because speaking it would contaminate the faith that held the Imperium together. The 10,000 were incorruptible, not because we could not be changed, but because we would not share what changed us. We absorbed the knowledge the cells contained, let it erode our certainty, felt our faith curdle into comprehension, and we maintained our vigil anyway, because someone had to guard these doors, and someone had to know why, and the Emperor had chosen us for this burden, because we could carry it without breaking loudly enough to shatter others' faith in the process. This was what Theron had understood. This was why he chose death over continued service, not because he feared corruption, but because he refused transformation. He wanted to die as the thing he had believed himself to be, rather than live as the thing the deep vaults had taught him he was. The worst discovery came 6 months into my education, when I finally accessed the deepest archives and found the document I should never have been authorized to read. It was a treatise, written in High Gothic so ancient that some of the grammatical structures no longer existed in modern imperial language, signed with a seal I recognized as the Emperor's personal mark from before the Imperium was formalized, before he had claimed the title of Master of Mankind. The text was titled, "On the Necessity of Ignorance, a Framework for Species-Level Survival." It was approximately 70,000 words of carefully reasoned philosophical argument, explaining why humanity's survival required the systematic suppression of its own history, the controlled destruction of knowledge that made humans too dangerous to themselves, the creation of myths that would override memory with more sustainable narratives. The Emperor himself had written a manual for the exact program the Imperium had been executing for 10,000 years. The treatise did not argue that humanity was too primitive for certain knowledge. It argued the opposite. Human ingenuity was so profound, so unstoppable, so capable of transforming possibility into reality regardless of consequences, that the species required artificial limitations on its own capability. We had created weapons that erased causality, plagues that murdered ambition, technologies that violated physics with such success that reality itself required patching. We had done this before we achieved interstellar travel, before we encountered Xenos threats, before chaos had gods with names. We had created apocalypses as casually as we created poetry, and every apocalypse we survived taught us how to create the next one more efficiently. The Emperor's argument was simple. A species this dangerous to itself could not be trusted with its own history. Ignorance was not a failure state. It was a deliberate survival mechanism, engineered by the one human intelligent enough to recognize that intelligence itself was humanity's existential threat. I sat in the archive chamber reading this treatise 3 times, feeling each word land like a hammer blow against the remains of my faith. The Emperor was not ignorant of what he had done when he built the Imperium on lies. He was not corrupted or fallen or compromised. He had calculated, with terrifying precision, that human survival required most humans to believe a simpler story than the true one, that faith was more sustainable than knowledge, that the Imperium's cruelty was not a failing, but a feature, a cage constructed around a species too brilliant and too destructive to be allowed freedom. And he had stationed the Adeptus Custodes in the deep vaults, not to guard prisoners, but to create a class of guardians who understood this truth, who could maintain the cage, knowing why it was necessary, who would sacrifice their own faith so that others could continue believing. The treatise included a section on the psychological requirements for deep vault wardens. The Emperor had calculated that unmodified humans would either go mad or rebel when exposed to the knowledge the cells contained. Astartes would maintain faith through indoctrination, but lacked the intellectual capacity to fully comprehend what they guarded, creating a failure mode where ignorance led to procedural collapse over sufficient time. Only the Adeptus Custodes possessed both the enhanced cognition to understand and the psychological resilience to maintain function after understanding destroyed faith. We were not incorruptible. We were durable enough to survive corruption, strong enough to continue our duty after everything that justified that duty had been revealed as engineered necessity rather than objective truth. The Emperor needed wardens who could guard these doors, knowing that what lay behind them was not just imprisoned monsters, but proof that the entire imperial ideology was a containment field maintaining something more dangerous than any individual weapon or plague or technology. It was containing human nature itself. I filed no reports about this discovery. What could I write? That I had accessed archives above my clearance level, something that should have been impossible given the Deep Vault's security protocols, unless access was intentionally granted as part of whatever educational process the cells administered to their wardens? That the foundation of imperial faith was explicitly designed to be false because truth was unsustainable? That the Emperor himself had written instructions for building a civilization on lies because humanity's survival required we forget what we were capable of becoming? Any report containing this information would be acknowledged and filed and archived alongside identical reports from previous wardens who had discovered the same truth through the same carefully constructed sequence of revelations. The cracks in our containment fields were intentional. The prisoners' communications were permitted. The archives were accessible to those whose faith had been eroded enough to seek them. This was the vigil, not guarding doors, but allowing what leaked through those doors to transform us into guardians who understood what we guarded. Cell 86 said, "You have read the treatise. You understand now. The question that remains is whether you can continue." I stood before its door, looking at the hairline crack that had never been repaired, understanding finally that repair was never intended. Your brother Theron could not. He chose death because he could not reconcile what he had been with what he learned. But you are still here, Valorian. You are still performing your inspections, still filing your reports, still maintaining the vigil even though faith no longer justifies it. What does that make you? I did not answer, but I knew. It made me complicit, not a victim but a participant. I had transformed from guardian into accomplice, maintaining a system whose purpose I now comprehended and whose necessity I could not deny, but whose cost I could finally calculate. Every cell I inspected contained evidence of what humanity was capable of when freed from limitations. Every door I sealed was a choice to maintain those limitations. Every report I filed was acceptance that the Imperium's lies were more valuable than any individual truth, including my own. This was what the Emperor had needed from his Custodes. Not warriors who would die defending faith, but survivors who would live defending function after faith died. The 10,000 were incorruptible because we could be corrupted utterly and still perform our duties. This was not strength. It was the specific kind of weakness required to serve a truth too crushing to be carried by strength alone. I continued my patrols for another year, watching my brother's Shadow Keepers move through their own educational processes, recognizing the stages of transformation as faith gave way to doubt. gave way to comprehension, gave way to whatever came after. Some of them maintained function, others did not. Brother Sentinel Callus requested immediate rotation after 250 years of service. 30 years before his scheduled completion, he was granted deployment to the Maelstrom Zone, where he died within 6 months fighting word-bearers who had declared his strike cruiser an abomination requiring cleansing. Castellan Vrac stopped filing reports entirely, still performed his patrols, but in silence that was not discipline, but erasure, walking through the deep vaults like a ghost haunting the scene of its own death. I understood both responses, understood that we each carried the knowledge differently, and that the Emperor had not required uniformity in our breaking, only that we break in ways that maintained function. The personal horror, the moment when knowledge became visceral rather than intellectual, came during a routine patrol when I found Cell 107's containment field had developed an actual breach, not a hairline crack, but a genuine failure. A gap in the psychoreactive matrix large enough that something could physically pass through if it possessed sufficient will. Protocol was explicit for this scenario. Immediate evacuation, emergency seal of the sector, deployment of null mating containment teams, full quarantine until repairs could be certified by the highest level Mechanicum adepts available. I activated emergency Vox channels, transmitted distress codes, prepared to fall back to secondary containment positions while specialized units responded. Then I noticed that my Vox transmission had been acknowledged, but no units were deploying. The response came through in text rather than voice. Maintain position. Observe and document. Standard protocol for Cell 107 events. Standard protocol. Cell 107 had breached before, multiple times, if the phrasing was accurate, and the response was not containment, but observation. I stood before the massive door, 30 meters of adamantium engraved with wards that blazed so brightly my enhanced vision registered pain, watching something emerge through the gap in the containment field. It was not large. It was barely the size of a human child, translucent and shifting, composed of geometries that my mind rejected even as my eyes tracked their movement. The thing paused at the threshold of the cell, tilted what might have been a head, regarded me with organs that were not eyes, but served an analogous function. Then it spoke, not through sound, but through meaning, that bypassed language entirely and planted itself directly into my consciousness. What it communicated was simple. It was the last surviving fragment of a human civilization that had achieved technological singularity during the dark age of technology, had transcended biological existence entirely, had rebuilt themselves as informational entities existing in quantum superposition across infinite parallel realities. They had become gods, functionally speaking, immortal, omniscient within their domain, capable of rewriting physical laws through pure calculation. Then they had discovered that godhood was a trap. The more powerful they became, the less human they remained, until the question of whether they still counted as human civilization had no meaningful answer. They had tried to reverse the process, failed, tried to die, failed, existed in a state that was neither life nor death, but something wounded and eternal and profoundly wrong. The Emperor had found them, or they had found him. Accounts varied. He had imprisoned the last fragment here, in Cell 107, not to punish it, but to preserve evidence that some victories over mortality were defeats by other names. The entity regarded me with something approximating pity. It said, without words, that it recognized what I was experiencing because it had experienced the same transformation. It had started as human, had believed ascension was progress, had pursued power and knowledge and transcendence with the same faith I had brought to my vigil. It had learned, too late, that some transformations could not be reversed, that becoming something greater than human meant losing the capacity to be human at all, and that this loss was not tragic in any sense that still felt real because tragedy required a self to suffer, and it had optimized the self into irrelevance. It was lonely in a way that preceded the existence of loneliness as a concept. It was trapped not by the cell, but by what it had become. And the cell was mercy, because at least containment gave it boundaries when its own nature had none. The entity retreated into cell 107 after communicating this. The breach sealed itself, though whether through mechanicum intervention or the prisoner's own cooperation, I could not determine. I filed my report, documenting the breach, the emergence, the communication, acknowledged within minutes. No further action required. Standard protocol for Cell 107 events. I stood in the corridor for an hour after completing my patrol, trying to process what I had witnessed, trying to fit it into any framework that made sense. The prisoner had not threatened me, had not tried to escape, had simply emerged long enough to teach me the same lesson Cell 86 had been teaching through months of patient conversation, that the deep vaults contained proof that human ambition was a form of existential threat, and that the Imperium's suppression of knowledge was not ignorance, but quarantine against our own capabilities. I thought about my sister then. For the first time in 2 centuries, she had been taken by the Emperor's selection protocols the same day I was. Both of us identified as possessing the genetic and psychological markers necessary for transformation into something greater than baseline human. I had become a custodian. She had been selected for a different program, one I was never briefed on, one whose existence was classified above my clearance level. I had assumed she served somewhere in the palace, in some capacity that utilized whatever gifts the Emperor had seen in her. I had believed this with the comfortable certainty that faith provides. After reading the treatise, after understanding what the deep vaults contained, I searched the archives for her name, found her file, found her designation, Biological Optimism Index 7, primary subject, terminated upon completion. She had not been transformed into a servant. She had been the raw material for Cell 67's prisoner. The Emperor's agents had taken her, used her, experimented on her, until they had successfully recreated the plague that murdered ambition, then terminated her existence once the data was secured. My sister was not serving the Imperium. She was imprisoned in Cell 67, reduced to a disease, her entire existence condensed into a weapon that wept because it could remember distantly, having once been a person who wanted things beyond satisfaction. I had walked past her cell for 217 years, had documented its containment stability with professional precision, had noted the sound of its weeping in my patrol reports, never knowing that I was guarding my sister's grave. This was not cruelty. This was calculation. The Emperor had needed to recreate that plague, had needed to understand how it functioned so he could recognize it if humanity encountered it again, had needed a sample for study and potential deployment if circumstances required a population to be pacified rather than exterminated. My sister had possessed the neurological architecture necessary to host the plague's development. She had been selected not for her potential to serve, but for her utility as a substrate for research that would save billions. The calculus was clean. One life traded for knowledge that might preserve the species. Except that one life had been a child who shared my genetic markers, who had been taken from our mother's arms the same moment I was, who had believed, as I had believed, that selection meant salvation rather than sacrifice. I stopped filing reports about Cell 67 after that discovery, stopped documenting its stability, still performed my inspections, still checked the containment field, still ensured it remained sealed, but could not force myself to write the words that transformed my sister into a classified asset requiring monitoring. The silence I maintained was not discipline. It was grief. I walked my patrol each day, knowing that every door I sealed was also a memorial, that the prisoners I guarded were not abstractions, but people who had been transformed into warnings, and that I was complicit in their imprisonment because I maintained the seals that kept them contained. This was what the Emperor had calculated custodians could endure, not just knowledge of what we guarded, but personal loss that made that knowledge impossible to treat as mere information. Cell 86 said, "You understand now why Shadow Keepers never rotate out." I stood before its door, no longer bothering to pretend I was not listening, accepting that communication was part of the vigil rather than a violation of it. You cannot return to the surface knowing what you know. You cannot walk among humans who still maintain faith, who still believe the Imperium's myths, who still think the Emperor is infallible, rather than simply willing to calculate costs that would paralyze anyone possessing less comprehensive intelligence. You have become something that does not fit in the world above. You fit here, in the darkness, where truth lives because it is too dangerous to exist in light. The prisoner was correct. I could not imagine returning to the palace surface, resuming duties among custodians who still believed their service was righteous rather than necessary, who still maintained faith as armor rather than recognizing that armor was unnecessary once you accepted you had already been wounded. The rotation that had been promised, the return to light after 2 centuries of darkness, felt like a fiction designed to maintain hope during the early stages of service, before the cells taught us that hope was another form of faith, and faith was another form of ignorance. And ignorance was the state we were being systematically educated out of. Shadow Keepers never rotated out because rotation assumed we remained fundamentally the same person we had been when we descended, and that person had died somewhere between the first crack in Cell 86's containment field. And the moment I read the treatise and understood that my sister's death had been filed under acceptable losses, see attached calculation, I requested a meeting with the ranking Shadow Keeper commander, a custodian named Tribune Valdor's Chosen, who had served in the deep vaults for 700 years and whose eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from carrying knowledge too heavy to set down. We met in a chamber far from the cells, a space maintained at temperature and pressure comfortable for baseline humans, though neither of us qualified as baseline anymore, and comfort was a concept that required some capacity for feeling that our transformations had optimized into irrelevance. I asked him directly, when does rotation occur? When do we return to surface duty? Tribune Valdor's Chosen looked at me with those empty eyes and said, Shadow Keepers never rotate out. The policy exists in documentation to maintain morale during early service. By the time most custodians realize rotation will not occur, they have learned why it cannot occur. You have learned. You understand. You will remain here until death or until the Imperium falls, whichever comes first. I asked, how many Shadow Keepers have requested deployment to active war zones rather than continue serving here? 47%, he said. They recognize that death in battle preserves the version of themselves that still fits the stories we tell about what custodians are. The rest of us remain because someone must maintain the vigil, and we have already paid the cost of knowing why. Paying that cost twice, by abandoning the duty it purchased, feels more obscene than simply continuing. I asked the question that mattered. Did the Emperor know this would happen to us? Did he calculate that custodians assigned here would be destroyed by what we learned? Tribune Valdor's Chosen was silent for long enough that I thought he would not answer. Then he said, he wrote the treatise 2,000 years before the Imperium was formalized. He knew. Everything we experience here, he anticipated. The cracks in the containment fields, the communications from prisoners, the access to archives, the discovery of personal connections to what we guard. All of it is designed. We are not guarding the dark cells. We are being educated by them. The Emperor needs a class of servants who understand the true nature of the Imperium, who can maintain its functions knowing that its foundation is engineered necessity rather than objective righteousness. He needs us broken in this specific way, functional but faithless, loyal but not believing, capable of maintaining darkness because we understand that light is a luxury humanity cannot afford while remaining human. He paused, and something flickered in those empty eyes that might have been regret or recognition or simply acknowledgement. The question he left us is whether this transformation is corruption or education, whether we have been compromised or enlightened. I have served for 7 centuries trying to answer that question. I have concluded that the distinction does not matter. We maintain the vigil regardless. That is what he calculated we would do, and we do it. And our compliance proves his calculations correct, which proves his right to have calculated us in the first place. The logic is circular. It is also inescapable. I left that meeting understanding that I had been given a choice that was not actually a choice: continue serving with knowledge that destroyed faith, or request deployment and die preserving ignorance. Both options served the Emperor's purpose. Both maintained the system. The only meaningful difference was whether I died as the person I had believed myself to be, or lived as the thing the deep vaults had educated me into becoming. I thought about Theron, who had chosen death. Thought about my sister, who had not been given a choice at all. Thought about the prisoner in cell 107, who had transcended humanity and discovered that transcendence was a trap more absolute than any cell forged from adamantium and psychoreactive alloys. I chose to remain, not because I believed the choice was right, but because I had already been transformed, and reversing that transformation was not possible. And dying to preserve a fiction about who I had been felt less honest than living as the thing I had become. This was what the Emperor had calculated custodians would choose: function over faith, duty over dignity, continuation over comfortable lies. We were incorruptible because corruption was just another word for transformation. And transformation was inevitable in an environment designed to teach rather than test. We could not be corrupted because we had already been educated. And education was a form of corruption that worked slowly enough to feel like enlightenment, until you realized enlightenment and corruption were the same process approached from different directions. The years that followed were not marked by revelation, but by repetition. I walked my patrol. I inspected containment fields. I documented anomalies. I filed reports that were acknowledged and never acted upon. I spoke with prisoners who taught me incrementally more complex truths about what the Imperium was built upon, and what it suppressed, and why that suppression was necessary if the species was to survive long enough to potentially deserve salvation. I watched new Shadow Keepers arrive for their first rotations, recognized the faith in their eyes, saw them walk past the cells with certainty that they were guarding prisoners who threatened humanity from outside, rather than learning that they were guarding evidence of what humanity threatened itself with from inside. I did not warn them, did not speak about what they would learn, maintained the silence that was not discipline, but mercy, because warning them would only accelerate the process without changing its outcome. Cell 86 said, during one inspection, "You have become what the Emperor needed you to become. Does that give you satisfaction? Knowing your transformation was anticipated and planned for and utilized?" I answered, for the first time since the prisoner had first spoken my name 3 years before. I said, "No, but satisfaction is not what I am here to feel. I am here to maintain seals on doors that contain humanity's true history. I am here to guard evidence that must not be destroyed but cannot be shared. I am here to serve a purpose that requires me to become something that understands why faith is insufficient." The Emperor calculated that I would do this. He was correct. His correctness does not require my satisfaction. It only requires my compliance. Cell 86 was silent for a moment. Then it said, "You sound like him now. Efficient, calculating, willing to trade pieces of yourself for outcomes that benefit entities you will never meet. This is what he needed. Custodians who could think like him without possessing his comprehensive intelligence. Guardians who could maintain his vision after learning that vision was constructed from materials more horrific than anyone maintaining faith could acknowledge. You have graduated from faith to comprehension. The question is whether comprehension is a higher state or simply a different form of imprisonment." I completed my inspection, documented stable containment, moved to the next cell in my sequence. The prisoner was correct. I had become something that thought in calculations rather than certainties, in systems rather than stories, in necessities rather than righteousness. This was corruption by any traditional definition. It was also the exact education the Emperor had designed the deep vaults to provide. The cells were not just prisons. They were schools, and every custodian assigned here was a student being taught that the Imperium was not righteous, but necessary, not true but functional, not good but survivable. We learned this curriculum alone, in isolation, through exposure to evidence that could not be refuted or rationalized away. We learned it, and we maintained our duties anyway, because the alternative was species extinction, and preventing extinction justified any transformation, any loss, any compromise of everything we had believed ourselves to be. I have served in the deep vaults for 293 years now. I will serve until I die, or until the Imperium falls. My rotation will never occur. My faith will never return. I have been transformed from guardian into accomplice, from warrior into administrator of truths too dangerous to acknowledge. I maintain seals on doors that contain my sister's weaponized remains. I document the stability of cells that hold evidence of humanity's capacity to create apocalypses casually. I walk corridors that breathe, and time that misbehaves, and darkness that has weight. I do this knowing it is necessary. Knowing it is horrible. Knowing that necessity and horror are not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same reality. The other Shadow Keepers and I maintain silence, not because we are disciplined, but because we are isolated. Each of us alone with our specific configuration of knowledge. Each of us carrying our particular education. Each of us transformed into something that serves function rather than faith. We pass each other during patrol rotations. We nod. We do not speak. What would we say? We already know what the others have learned. We already understand why silence is the only appropriate response. Speaking would only force us to acknowledge aloud what we have become, and that acknowledgement would serve no purpose except to make the transformation explicit rather than implicit. Better to maintain the fiction that we are still custodians, still warriors, still guardians of humanity's future. Better to pretend that service justifies transformation than to admit transformation was the service the Emperor had always intended us to perform. I stand before Cell 114 now, the one that does not exist in any official documentation, the one whose absence I have walked past for 3 centuries, the one that Cell 86 claimed was relocated inside my skull to teach me to see. I can perceive it now, in ways I could not during my early service. It is there, has always been there, exists in a state that official reality cannot acknowledge, but which becomes visible once your perception has been educated to recognize truths that documentation suppresses. The cell contains nothing and everything simultaneously. It is empty because what it held has been distributed among all Shadow Keepers who serve long enough to develop the perception necessary to recognize it exists. It is full because every one of us carries a fragment of what it contained. The knowledge that we are not guarding prisoners, but being transformed by them. That our vigil is not protection, but education. That the Emperor designed this system, knowing it would destroy us in exactly this way, because he needed servants who could function after faith failed. Cell 114 is us, the Shadow Keepers. We are what it contains. We are the prisoners it guards. We have been relocated into ourselves, transformed into cells that contain dangerous knowledge, sealed with silence that prevents contamination, monitored through our own reports that document our psychological transformation with the same precision we document containment field stability. We are the dark cell's most successful prisoners because we maintain our own imprisonment willingly, understanding that the alternative is releasing truths that would destroy the faith billions of humans require to maintain function within systems that would collapse if examined too closely. I am writing this testimony in violation of every protocol I have spent 3 centuries maintaining. I am writing it because I have concluded that some truths require documentation, even if that documentation will be sealed away unread, buried in archives where future Shadow Keepers will find it during their own educational process and recognize their transformation was not unique. I am writing it because silence, while necessary, is also a form of complicity that benefits only the system, never the servants who maintain it. I am writing it as witness statement, as evidence that what happens here is known, calculated, engineered, as proof that the Emperor's design included our destruction, and we enacted it willingly because the alternative was abandoning duty, and duty was all we had left once faith died. My name is Valorian Teth. I am Shadow Keeper of the Adeptus Custodes, 3rd Warden of the Deep Vaults, prisoner of Cell 114 that exists only in spaces where official reality fails. I am 311 years old. I will never rotate to surface duty. I will never again serve among custodians who maintain faith. I will walk these corridors until death claims me, or until the Imperium falls and the dark cells breach and the prisoners emerge carrying knowledge that humanity suppressed for 10,000 years in the desperate hope that ignorance would prove more survivable than truth. I am still loyal. This must be understood. My loyalty was never to faith, but to function, never to righteousness, but to necessity, never to the stories we told about what the Imperium was, but to the reality of what it needed to be for humanity to survive one more generation. The Emperor calculated that some of his servants would need to understand this distinction. He was correct. He is always correct, in the way that any being capable of calculating infinite variables across 10,000 years of causality will achieve correctness through sheer comprehensive intelligence, regardless of whether that correctness aligns with any recognizable definition of goodness. I do not know if what I have become is corruption or enlightenment. I suspect the distinction is irrelevant. I maintain the vigil. I guard the doors. I preserve the seals. I document anomalies. I file reports that are acknowledged and never acted upon. I walk past cell 67 and whisper apologies to my sister that she cannot hear because she is not imprisoned there, except as a disease vector, her personhood having been optimized away in the process of transforming her into a weapon. I stand before cell 86 and listen to it teach new truths, with the patience of something that has eternity to work with. I inspect cell 107's containment field and remember what the transcendent entity communicated about godhood being a trap that only feels like victory until you realize you have lost the capacity to recognize loss. This is what Shadow Keepers are. We are the Emperor's students in a curriculum designed to destroy faith while maintaining function. We are the wardens of truths too dangerous to release, but too valuable to destroy. We are the necessary casualties of a system that requires some humans understand it completely, so that most humans can continue believing comforting fictions. We are incorruptible because we have already been corrupted in exactly the way the Emperor calculated we could survive. We are loyal because loyalty is all that remains once faith has been educated into comprehension. If you are reading this, you are likely a Shadow Keeper beginning your own transformation. You have found this document through the same archival access that allowed me to find the treatise, the same systematic education that the dark cells provide to all who serve here long enough. You will make the same discoveries I made. You will experience the same revelations. You will transform in similar ways, though the specific configuration of your knowledge will be unique to you, because the cells teach each student differently based on which truths they are psychologically capable of carrying. You will eventually understand that this education was intentional, that your destruction was calculated, that your transformation serves a purpose the Emperor determined was necessary for humanity's survival. You will face the same choice Theron faced. Continue serving with knowledge that destroys faith, or request deployment and die preserving ignorance. Most choose death. Some choose continuation. Neither choice is wrong because both maintain the system, and maintaining the system is all that matters when the alternative is species extinction. You will make your choice based on factors I cannot predict. You will live or die according to what you conclude you can endure. The Emperor has calculated all outcomes. Your decision will not surprise him. It was already accounted for in designs laid 10,000 years before you were born. I end this testimony with the truth that the dark cells taught me, the one that every Shadow Keeper learns eventually, the one that makes rotation impossible and silence necessary and transformation inevitable. We do not guard the dark cells from what is inside. We guard Terra from what we would become if we ever left. We contain knowledge that would shatter faith if released. We are the cells now, walking containers of dangerous truths, sealed by our own understanding that some education cannot be shared without destroying the students who receive it. We maintain the vigil knowing the vigil has transformed us into the very thing we guard. This is what the Emperor designed. This is what we serve. This is what we have become. I am Valorian Teth. I was incorruptible. I have been educated. I remain loyal because loyalty is all that survives when faith dies. I stand in darkness so others may live in light, and I know now that the darkness is not what lies behind the cell doors, but what lies behind my own eyes. In spaces where certainty used to live, before the cells taught me that certainty was always just another word for ignorance. The Emperor knew. He has always known. His knowledge does not require our understanding. It only requires our service. We serve. We transform. We maintain the vigil. This is what Shadow Keepers are. This is what we have always been. Since the moment we were selected, since the moment we descended, since the moment we believed we were guarding prisoners when we were actually becoming them. The dark cells do not contain monsters. They contain teachers, and we are their most dedicated students, learning lessons that destroy us in ways that leave us functional, educated in truths that make faith impossible, but do not make duty any less absolute. We are the Emperor's necessary casualties, transformed into living cells that walk the corridors of Terra's deepest vaults, maintaining seals on doors that lead inward rather than outward, guarding humanity from itself by becoming the thing humanity cannot be allowed to acknowledge it created. This testimony will be archived. It will be found by the next Shadow Keeper who serves long enough to earn access. They will read it and recognize themselves in my words, and they will understand that their transformation was not unique, and they will continue their vigil anyway, because that is what we do. That is all we do. That is all we have left to do once the cells finish teaching us what we are.